The transmission light on my desk had not stopped blinking for 6 hours, and every flash meant another counselor screaming for updated paperwork. I had served the Galactic Tribute Council for 11 years. I had processed 43 tribute hearings. I had watched species twice our size walk into the Great Chamber on shaking legs and leave with empty treasuries. Not once, in all those years, had a species refused. Not once had I even considered the possibility. Tribute was gravity. You did not argue with it. You did not negotiate. You simply fell. My name is Valen Sho, and I was a junior diplomatic aide stationed on the orbital platform Aegis Primus, the administrative heart of the Council's 12,000-year dominion over known space. My job was simple. I prepared compliance documents. I filed resource allocation reports. I made sure the ink was dry before the new subjects signed away their futures. I was good at my job. I believed in my job. Everything was orderly, predictable, and under control. Then humanity arrived. The hearing had been scheduled for the third rotation of the harvest cycle, a standard Tuesday by their reckoning. The tribute chamber itself was designed to intimidate. Ceilings stretched 40 meters overhead, carved from the black stone of a dead moon. The seats of the 12 high counselors rose in tiered arcs, like the ribcage of some enormous creature, each one lit from beneath, so the occupants appeared to float in pools of pale light. Every surface was engineered to make the summoned species feel small. It had worked on every species before. The human delegation was supposed to be a group. Our intelligence reports indicated a formal envoy of 12 diplomats, military advisors, and cultural attachés. Instead, one person walked through the chamber doors. A single woman, average height, wearing a dark blue uniform with no medals and no visible rank insignia beyond a simple silver bar on her collar. She carried a thin datapad in her left hand. She did not bow, she did not hesitate. She walked to the center of the chamber floor, stopped at the exact geometric center of the speaking circle, and stood with her hands clasped behind her back as if she were waiting for a bus. Her name, according to my file, was Captain Marin Cole, 41 years old, born in a coastal city called Bristol, on the western edge of their primary continent. Former educator, recruited into their Unified Space Command 8 years prior. No combat record, no diplomatic credentials, no obvious reason to be standing where she was standing. Doyen Rethak, the head of the Tribute Council, leaned forward in his elevated seat and studied her. Rethak was old, not just old by our standards, but old by geological standards. He had overseen the council for 600 years, and his predecessor had held the seat for 400 before him. The system worked because the system had always worked. Rethak looked at Marin Cole the way you might look at a stray animal that had wandered into a formal banquet. Mild curiosity, faint amusement, complete certainty that the situation was already decided. He began the standard tribute recitation. I had heard it so many times I could recite it from memory. The words were ancient, formal, and deliberately slow, designed to let the weight of each clause settle on the shoulders of the summoned species, like stones dropped one by one into a sack. 40% of Earth's rare mineral output to be delivered in quarterly shipments to Council processing stations, permanent garrison rights in the Sol system, allowing Council military vessels unrestricted access to all orbital lanes, and the conscription tithe, 200,000 human soldiers per standard cycle, to serve in Council enforcement fleets across the outer territories. I watched Marin Cole while Rethak spoke. She did not flinch. She did not take notes. She did not whisper to an advisor because she had no advisor. She simply listened, her eyes moving from one counselor to the next with a slow, measured attention that reminded me of something I could not quite name. Later, I would realize what it was. She was not listening to the words. She was counting exits. Rethak finished the recitation and folded his long hands together. Then he asked the ritual question, the same question that had been asked 43 times in my tenure and thousands of times before that. His voice echoed through the vast chamber with the practiced resonance of absolute authority. What does your species offer in tribute? I had my stylus ready. I had the compliance form open on my screen. I had already filled in Earth's coordinates, population figures, and resource estimates. All I needed was the formal acceptance phrase, and the document would be complete. Standard procedure. 5 minutes of ceremony, a signature, and the galaxy kept turning. Marin Cole looked up at Doyen Rethak. She did not raise her voice. She did not clench her fists or straighten her spine, or do any of the dozen small theatrical things that frightened diplomats sometimes did, to preserve their dignity in the final moment before surrender. She simply answered, "No." One word, one syllable, spoken at a conversational volume, in a chamber designed to swallow sound and make the speaker feel like a whisper against a hurricane. My stylus stopped moving. The compliance form stayed open on my screen, cursor blinking in the empty signature field. Around me, other aides froze at their stations. I heard someone drop a data tablet 3 rows behind me, the sharp crack of it hitting the stone floor, the only sound in a chamber that suddenly held no air. Rethak did not react immediately. He stared at her for several long seconds, his expression unchanged, and I realized he was waiting for her to correct herself. A translation error, a cultural misunderstanding, a momentary lapse in protocol that would be smoothed over with an apology and the proper tribute phrase. These things happened occasionally with younger species. Language was complicated. Fear made people inarticulate. Surely that was all this was. "The translation may have been imprecise," Rethak said, his tone carefully neutral. "I will repeat the question. What does your species offer in tribute to the Galactic Council?" Marin Cole did not shift her weight. She did not blink. "No." Same word, same tone, same volume, as if she were declining a second cup of tea. The silence that followed was unlike any silence I had experienced in that chamber. I had heard the silence of terrified species waiting for their fate. I had heard the silence of grudging acceptance, of swallowed pride, of civilizations realizing that their sovereignty was a thing of the past. But this silence was different. This silence was confusion. The system had encountered an input it did not recognize, and for the first time in my career, I watched the machine stall. Counselor Dreth, the military overseer, broke the silence first. He leaned forward and spoke with the kind of forced patience that large creatures use when addressing something they could crush without effort. "Perhaps the human does not understand the nature of this proceeding. This is not a negotiation. This is not a request. This is a declaration of terms." Marin Cole turned her gaze to Dreth. "I understood every word," she said. "My answer remains the same." "Your answer is not an option," Dreth replied, his voice hardening. "And yet I gave it." The chamber erupted, not into shouting exactly, but into the kind of urgent, overlapping whisper that happens when powerful people realize, simultaneously, that they do not know what to do. I watched counselors turning to aides, aides turning to legal advisors turning to each other. Nobody had a protocol for this. There was no form for refusal. There was no subsection in the tribute code that addressed what happened when a species simply said no, because in 12,000 years, it had never occurred to anyone that it needed to exist. I looked back at Marin Cole. She had not moved. She stood at the center of that storm of whispered panic, as if she were standing alone in an empty field, and the expression on her face was the thing that would keep me awake for the next several nights. It was not defiance. It was not bravado. It was patience. She looked like someone who had rehearsed this moment 1,000 times and knew exactly what came next. Doyen Rethak raised one hand, and the whispers stopped. The chamber fell back into that awful, loaded silence. He looked at Marin Cole for a long time, and I saw something in his expression I had never seen in 600 years of recorded footage. He was uncertain. "This hearing is suspended," he said. "The council will deliberate. The human delegation will remain on the station under diplomatic escort until a resolution is determined." Marin Cole nodded once, turned, and walked toward the exit. Her footsteps echoed in the empty chamber, steady and unhurried, each one landing with the same calm rhythm as if she were walking through a park on a quiet afternoon. As she passed my station, she glanced at my screen. The compliance form was still open, the signature field still empty, the cursor still blinking. She looked at it, then looked at me, and for a moment our eyes met. She did not smile. She did not gloat. She simply met my gaze with an expression that said she already knew what I was only beginning to suspect. That this was not a refusal. This was a beginning. After she left, Rethak ordered me to pull Earth's complete military assessment file. I accessed the archive, entered the species designation, and waited. The file that appeared was thin, embarrassingly thin. Humanity had been spacefaring for approximately 90 standard years. They possessed a small defensive fleet of roughly 300 vessels, none larger than a light cruiser. Their weapons technology was at least 2 generations behind Council standard. Their population was concentrated on a single planet in a single system, at the edge of an unremarkable spiral arm. By every measurable metric, they were nothing. I compiled the file, attached the relevant economic data, and sent it to Rethek's personal terminal. Then I sat at my desk and stared at the empty compliance form for a very long time. Around me, the other aides resumed their work, processing tribute documents from species that had said yes, because every species said yes. The machine resumed its function. The forms were filled, the quotas were assigned. But I could not stop thinking about the look on her face, not the defiance, not the courage, the patience. Marin Cole had walked into a chamber designed to make her feel like nothing, faced down a council that had broken civilizations older and stronger than hers, and she had not been afraid. Or if she had been afraid, she had buried it so deep that it did not reach her eyes or her voice, or the steady rhythm of her footsteps on that ancient stone floor. I closed the compliance form without saving. For the first time in 11 years, I did not complete a tribute document. I told myself it was because the hearing had been suspended. I told myself I would finish it when the situation was resolved. But somewhere beneath those rational explanations, in a place I did not yet have the courage to examine, I knew the truth. That form was never going to be completed, and nothing would ever be the same. I went to my quarters that night and pulled up everything the archive had on Earth. Not the military file, not the economic data. I searched for something else, something the standard assessment would never include. I searched for their history. And what I found in those records, buried beneath dry demographic tables and resource surveys, was the thing that should have been on the first page of every intelligence briefing the Council had ever produced about humanity. They had been fighting since before they could write. Not border disputes, not territorial skirmishes. Wars. Real wars. Wars that consumed entire continents, and killed millions, and reshaped the surface of their planet. They fought over land, over resources, over ideas, over gods, over pride. They fought each other with sticks and stones, and then with metal and gunpowder, and then with machines and chemicals, and finally with the energy locked inside the atom itself. And the part that kept me staring at my ceiling long after I should have been asleep was this. They survived all of it. Every war, every catastrophe, every self-inflicted wound that should have ended them. They did not just survive, they came back stronger. Every conflict produced new technology, new alliances, new ways of thinking. They were not a species that had learned peace through wisdom. They were a species that had learned survival through an almost pathological refusal to stay down. I lay in the dark and thought about Marin Cole standing in that chamber and saying no, and I realized that for her, that moment had not been extraordinary. It had not required special courage or unusual defiance. She had simply done what humans had always done when a larger force told them to kneel. She said no, and she meant it. So why? I kept asking myself as the station hummed and the stars turned outside my small window. Why did she look at us like we were the ones who should be afraid? 3 days passed after the refusal, and the Council had done nothing. I want to make sure that fact lands properly, because in my 11 years of service, I had never seen the Council take 3 days to do nothing. This was the governing body that had dismantled entire civilizations over lunch. They once levied an enforcement action against a species of aquatic traders during a routine session break because the paperwork was already filed and there was time to kill before the next agenda item. The Council moved fast because the Council never needed to think. The system was the system. Pay or be broken. Simple. But for 3 days after a single human woman said a single word, the 12 most powerful individuals in known space sat in closed chambers and argued. I was not privy to those arguments directly, but I heard them through the walls, through the aides who shuttled documents back and forth, through the tight expressions on faces that were never supposed to show strain. The debate was not about whether to punish humanity. That much was certain from the first hour. You could not allow a species to refuse tribute and walk away. The precedent alone would unravel everything. If one species said no and survived, every species would wonder why they had said yes. The argument was about scale. How many ships? How much force? Whether to make an example or simply compel compliance. And the fact that this argument existed at all, that 12 counselors who had crushed resistance 100 times before could not agree on how to handle a species with 300 light cruisers and a 90-year space program, told me something important was happening beneath the surface, something none of them would say out loud. They were not arguing about tactics. They were arguing because they were unsettled, and unsettled people argue about details to avoid confronting the thing that actually frightens them. I spent those 3 days doing what I always did when the council deliberated. I compiled data. I organized files. I prepared contingency documents. But this time, instead of filling out compliance forms, I had been assigned a different task. Doyen Rethak wanted a full intelligence dossier on humanity, not the standard military and economic summary that accompanied every tribute hearing. He wanted everything: history, culture, psychology, behavioral patterns, what made them function. I had compiled similar dossiers for other species before, and they were usually straightforward. Most civilizations in the galactic community followed recognizable patterns. They developed technology, expanded cautiously, built stable governance structures, and eventually accepted council authority because the alternative was destruction, and the tribute rates were survivable. Their histories were arcs from chaos to order, from conflict to stability, from individual ambition to collective compliance. The dossiers read like instruction manuals for predictable machines. Earth's dossier was not like that. The first thing I noticed was the wars. I had seen the overview during my late-night reading after the hearing, but the full data set was something else entirely. Humanity's recorded history covered roughly 5,000 years, and I could not find a single century without a major armed conflict somewhere on their planet. Not a single one. They fought wars of conquest, wars of liberation, wars of religion, wars of ideology, wars of succession, wars of honor, and wars that started for reasons so tangled that their own historians still argued about the causes thousands of years later. I catalogued their major conflicts, and the numbers made my hands still over the keyboard. A war they called the Second World War killed between 70 and 85 million of them in 6 years. Their total population at the time was roughly 2.5 billion. They lost 3% of their entire species in a single conflict and emerged from it as the dominant power on their planet. Not diminished, not chastened, dominant. But the wars were not the part that disturbed me most. The part that made me set down my stylus and stare at the wall was what happened after each war. They rebuilt. Every single time. Cities leveled to rubble were rebuilt within a generation. Economies shattered by years of conflict were restructured and expanded. Technologies developed for destruction were repurposed for medicine, communication, transportation, exploration. They took the worst things they did to each other and alchemized them into progress. Their atomic weapons were the perfect example. They unlocked the fundamental energy of matter itself, and the first thing they did was build a device that could flatten a city. 2 cities, in fact. They used it. And then, within 2 decades, they were using the same physics to generate power for millions of homes, to develop medical imaging that could see inside a living body, to design propulsion systems that would eventually carry them beyond their own atmosphere. The same science, the same energy. Destruction and creation drawn from the same source, separated only by intent. I included all of this in the dossier, but I found myself adding notes in the margins that were not strictly professional, observations that went beyond data into something closer to warning. I wrote that humanity did not view conflict the way other species did. For most civilizations, war was a failure state, something that happened when systems broke down. For humans, war was an engine. A terrible, costly, devastating engine that somehow produced more innovation per cycle than peace ever did. They did not want war. Many of their greatest thinkers had dedicated their lives to preventing it. But when war came, they did not simply endure it. They metabolized it. They absorbed the destruction and converted it into capability. I was still compiling the dossier on the morning of the fourth day when my supervisor, a senior aide named Kessoff, informed me that the human ambassador had requested a second audience with the council. Not to negotiate, he emphasized, not to present a revised tribute offer. She had specifically stated that she wished to deliver a warning. The chamber was configured differently for this session. The counselors were arranged in a tighter formation, leaning forward in their seats, and the lighting had been adjusted to eliminate shadows from the speaking floor. Everything was designed to make the space feel smaller, more oppressive, more controlled. They wanted Marin Cole to feel the walls closing in. She walked in wearing the same uniform, the same silver bar on her collar, the same calm expression. She took her position at the center of the speaking circle and waited. Doyen Rethak did not bother with formalities this time. He spoke directly. You have requested this audience. The council will hear your statement. Marin Cole nodded. I am here as a courtesy, she said, and her voice carried through the chamber with a clarity that made several counselors shift in their seats. I know what the council is preparing. A military enforcement action against Earth, a fleet to blockade Sol, and compel our compliance. I am here to advise against this course of action. Counselor Dreth, the military overseer, made a sound that might have been a laugh. You advise against it? How generous. I advise against it, Marin repeated, because you will lose. The chamber did not erupt this time. Instead, it went very quiet. The kind of quiet that happens when someone says something so unexpected that the listeners need a moment to decide if they heard correctly. You will lose, Marin continued, because Earth has been preparing for this scenario since before we made first contact with your council. 14 years before your survey ships detected our communications, our deep space observatories identified council enforcement actions against 3 separate civilizations in neighboring sectors. We watched the Prelian Collective pay tribute and lose 40% of their industrial capacity within a decade. We watched the Korath Federation resist and get blockaded into economic collapse within 2 years. We watched the Delvian Republic attempt to negotiate and end up paying more than the original demand after 3 cycles of escalating penalties. She paused and looked around the chamber, making eye contact with each counselor in turn. We studied your pattern. We analyzed your fleet compositions, your tactical doctrines, your standard enforcement timelines. And then we spent the next 90 years making sure that when you eventually found us and made your demand, we would be ready. I watched Doyen Rethak's face during this speech, and I saw something I had never seen in any archive footage or personal experience. His expression did not change, his composure did not break, but his hands, those long, ancient hands that had signed 10,000 tribute orders, tightened on the armrests of his seat until the joints went pale. Your military assessment lists 300 vessels, Rethak said carefully. The enforcement fleet will consist of 200 frontline warships. You are outnumbered in tonnage by a factor of 12 and outgunned by a factor of 30. Your technology is at least 2 generations behind ours. These are not opinions. These are measurements. Marin Cole smiled for the first time. It was not a warm smile. It was the smile of someone laying down a winning hand in a game the other player did not realize was already over. Those are the ships we let you see. The silence that followed lasted 11 seconds. I counted. In a room full of beings who controlled the fate of 1,000 worlds, 11 seconds of absolute silence was an eternity. Rethak broke it. This audience is concluded. The enforcement decree stands. A fleet will be dispatched to Sol within the standard cycle. Marin Cole nodded, as if she had expected nothing else. Understood. She turned to leave, then stopped. For the record, I want it noted that we warned you, formally, with witnesses present. Whatever happens next, your council chose it. She walked toward the exit. As she passed my station, she glanced at my screen. The dossier was open, scrolled to the section on Earth's military-industrial history. She paused for half a step, read a line or two, and without looking at me, said quietly, "You are reading the right file." Then she was gone, and the chamber was left with the sound of counselors talking too fast and aides scrambling for updated military projections, and me sitting at my desk, with her words echoing in my head, like a stone dropped into a well that had no bottom. That evening, I returned to the dossier. I was supposed to finalize it and submit it to Rethak's office by morning, but instead of writing the executive summary, I found myself going back to the section on human industrial capacity. There was a specific data point that had caught my attention during my initial research, and I wanted to look at it again. During the conflict they called the Second World War, one nation, the United States, with a population of roughly 130 million people, produced approximately 300,000 military aircraft in 4 years. Not purchased, not acquired, produced. From raw materials to finished machines. Factories that had been making cars and refrigerators were retooled in weeks to manufacture bombers and fighters. Civilian workers, many of them women who had never held an industrial job before, operated the assembly lines around the clock. 300,000 aircraft in 4 years from a single nation. I sat at my desk and did the math that no one on the council had thought to do. Earth's current population was approximately 8.5 billion. Their industrial infrastructure had expanded by orders of magnitude since that ancient war. Their materials science, automation capabilities, and manufacturing efficiency were incomparably more advanced, and according to Marin Cole, they had been specifically preparing for a military confrontation for 90 years. I did not finalize the dossier that night. I was still staring at my calculations when the first shift aides arrived the next morning. The enforcement fleet, 200 warships, launched from Aegis Primus at dawn, and I watched them go from the observation gallery with a feeling in my chest that I had never experienced before. It should have been more. Whatever was waiting in that system at the edge of that unremarkable spiral arm, 200 ships was not going to be enough. I was certain of it, the way you are certain of weather. Not because of evidence, because of pressure. The fleet launched, and the countdown began, and I went back to my desk and waited for the thing that I somehow already knew was coming. Nothing. That is what came back from the Sol system. Nothing at all. The fleet was supposed to arrive on the 6th day, standard faster-than-light transit from Aegis Primus to the Sol system, following the established corridor through the outer reach and into the spiral arm. 6 days out. Half a day to establish the blockade perimeter, communications confirming fleet deployment within hours of arrival. On the 6th day, the communications division at Aegis Primus received nothing. On the 7th day, nothing. By the 8th day, the silence had spread through every level of the station, like a cold current through deep water. I sat at my desk and watched the senior communications officers cycle through every available frequency, every backup channel, every emergency protocol that had been established for exactly this kind of scenario. The equipment was functioning. The relay stations along the transit corridor were operational. The signal paths were clear. There was simply nothing coming through. 200 warships, crew complement of over 600,000 personnel, the most advanced military technology in known space, and they had gone quiet as if someone had simply switched them off. The council convened an emergency session on the 9th day, and for the first time in my career, I watched the 12 high counselors enter the chamber without their usual measured composure. They did not float in their pools of pale light with the serene authority of beings who controlled the galaxy. They hurried. They talked over each other. They looked, and I do not use this word lightly, because I had genuinely never had cause to apply it to the council before, frightened. Doyen Rethak demanded explanations from the military division. The fleet commander, Admiral Soren, who had remained on Aegis Primus to coordinate from the strategic center, stood before the council and delivered a report that consisted primarily of the phrase, "We do not yet have information." He said it 14 times in 12 minutes. I counted, because counting gave me something to do with my hands besides shake. The theories proliferated, equipment failure across the entire fleet, an unknown spatial anomaly in the Sol system, interference from a natural electromagnetic source. Each theory was proposed, examined, and discarded within minutes, because each one required a coincidence so enormous that it strained even the most creative interpretation of probability. 200 ships did not all lose communications simultaneously due to equipment failure. That was not how equipment worked. On the 10th day, the long-range sensors detected a ship incoming on the fleet's return corridor. A single ship. The identification beacon marked it as the corvette Tessic, a light escort vessel, the smallest ship in the enforcement fleet's complement. It was moving at reduced speed, And as it drew closer, the sensor readings began to tell a story that the communications silence had only hinted at. The hull of the Tessic was scored with weapon impacts, not kinetic rounds, which the Council's military understood thoroughly, and not standard energy weapons, which followed predictable damage patterns. These were something else. The burns were precise, concentrated, and placed with a surgical accuracy that suggested the attacker had known exactly where the Tessic's armor was weakest. Every impact was on a structural joint, a sensor cluster, or a power conduit junction. Whoever had fired on this ship had not been trying to destroy it. They had been disabling it with the care of a surgeon marking incision points on a patient. The Tessic docked at Aegis Primus on the evening of the 10th day, and its captain, a decorated enforcement officer named Torek Vaughn, was brought directly to the council chamber. I was in the room because the session required a full documentation staff, and as Vaughn walked to the speaking circle, I noticed two things. First, he was physically unharmed, not a scratch. Whatever had happened in the Sol system, the aggressors had not targeted personnel. Second, his eyes had the particular unfocused quality that I had only ever seen in footage of soldiers returning from campaigns against the Keth Swarm, the most devastating military engagement in Council history. Torek Vaughn had seen something that his mind was still trying to process, and the processing was not going well. Rethak did not waste time on pleasantries. Report. Vaughn straightened, and to his credit, his voice was steady. The fleet exited faster than light transit, at the designated coordinates, near the fourth planet of the Sol system, the gas giant they called Jupiter. Standard deployment protocol. Sensor sweep initiated immediately upon arrival. He paused. In the silence, I could hear the ventilation system humming 3 floors above us. The sensor sweep detected weapons platforms. Council military intelligence had projected 0 orbital defense installations in the Sol system. The actual count was 4,712. The number hung in the air. I typed it into my record and stared at it. 4,712 weapons platforms, hidden, undetected by 90 years of Council observation. I thought about Marin Cole saying, "Those are the ships we let you see," and the bottom dropped out of my understanding of what was happening. The platforms were distributed throughout the system, Vaughn continued, his voice mechanical now, reciting facts to keep himself anchored. Concealed in the asteroid belt between the 4th and 5th planetary orbits, embedded in the moons of the outer gas giants, drifting in the ring systems, positioned on the dark side of every significant body in the system. They were cold, no energy signatures, no thermal output. They had been sitting there, dormant and invisible, waiting. Waiting for what? Counselor Dreth demanded. For us, Vaughn said. The platforms activated simultaneously, Vaughn explained, the moment the fleet completed its sensor sweep, not before. The humans had let the Council fleet see the full scope of what was arrayed against them before turning anything on. They wanted the fleet to know. They wanted the numbers on every tactical display, the 4,712 contacts lighting up across every screen on every bridge of every ship, to be the first thing the enforcement fleet processed. Admiral Kessler, the fleet commander in the field, had ordered an immediate tactical reassessment. The platforms alone were a significant threat, but the fleet's firepower advantage was still substantial. 200 Council warships carried enough ordnance to crack a small moon. The platforms were stationary targets. Kessler began organizing firing solutions. That was when the second wave appeared. Ships, Vaughn said. Not 300. Not the number in our intelligence reports. Over 2,000. They came from behind the gas giants, from the asteroid belt, from orbital stations concealed in the upper atmosphere of the 4th planet itself. Fast ships, small, maneuverable in ways our tracking systems were not calibrated for. 2,000 ships, Rethek repeated. His voice was flat. At minimum, our sensors were having difficulty maintaining accurate counts because the human vessels were employing some form of signature, masking that cycled through random patterns. Every time we locked a count, it changed. We could not determine if we were tracking the same ship twice or a new contact. Vaughn described what happened next in the clipped, factual language of a military officer delivering a debrief, but underneath the professional veneer, I could hear something rawer, something closer to disbelief. The human ships did not engage at range. They closed distance at speeds that should have been impossible for vessels of their size, weaving through the fleet's defensive fire with a coordination that was not coordination at all. Council fleet doctrine was based on synchronized formations, every ship moving in concert according to predetermined tactical patterns perfected over millennia. The humans had no formation. Each ship moved independently, making decisions in real time, adapting to conditions that changed by the second. It was chaos, but it was effective chaos. And then they boarded. Small assault craft detached from the lead vessels, Vaughn said. They attached to our hulls using magnetic clamps and plasma cutters that were specifically designed, for Council hull specifications. They knew our armor composition. They knew our airlock configurations. They knew where the structural weak points were on every class of ship in the fleet. How? Dreth interrupted. We believe they recovered wreckage from previous Council enforcement actions in neighboring sectors. They had been collecting debris from our operations for decades, reverse engineering our ship designs, learning our specifications, preparing breaching equipment tailored to our exact hull construction. The boarding actions were fast, surgical, and overwhelmingly effective. Human soldiers moved through Council warships in small teams, bypassing defended positions, targeting bridge crews and engine rooms with non-lethal suppression tools that incapacitated without killing. Not a single Council crew member was fatally harmed during the entire engagement. Vaughn emphasized this point 3 times, and each time he said it, his voice carried a bewilderment that went beyond tactical surprise into something philosophical. They could have destroyed the fleet. The weapons platforms alone had enough firepower to reduce 200 warships to expanding clouds of debris. The 2,000 combat vessels could have engaged from range and picked the fleet apart without ever risking a boarding action. The humans had chosen the harder, more dangerous, more resource-intensive option, putting their own soldiers at risk to capture Council ships intact and keep Council personnel alive. The fleet admiral surrendered 9 hours after initial contact, Vaughn said. All 200 ships were boarded and secured. All crew were disarmed, given medical attention where needed, provided with rations, and confined to quarters. The humans treated our wounded before their own. The chamber was silent. I had stopped typing minutes ago. My hands were flat on the desk, pressing down as if I needed to confirm that something solid still existed beneath me. The Tessic was released deliberately, Vaughn concluded. I was given a recorded message to deliver to the Council. Rethak nodded. Play it. Vaughn produced a small audio device, standard Council recording equipment that the humans had apparently returned to him along with his personal effects, and placed it on the speaking circle pedestal. He pressed the activation control. Marin Cole's voice filled the tribute chamber. Calm, measured, almost conversational. This is Captain Marin Cole, speaking on behalf of the United Earth Command. We have retained your enforcement fleet. All 200 vessels are intact. All personnel are alive and being held under conditions that meet or exceed your own military detention standards. Consider this a deposit against future misunderstandings. You are welcome to send another fleet. We could use the spare parts. The message ended. The silence that followed was the same silence that had filled the chamber when Marin Cole first said no. I recognized it now. It was not the silence of shock or confusion or anger. It was the silence of a system encountering an outcome it was not designed to process. A silence that said, in the blankest possible terms, we do not have a protocol for this. Doyen Rethak sat in his elevated seat and said nothing. Councillor Dreth said nothing. The military advisors, the legal staff, the senior aides, the entire apparatus of the most powerful governing body in known space said nothing. Because there was nothing to say. For the first time in 12,000 years, the Council had sent an enforcement fleet, and the enforcement fleet had not come back. The species that took it had 90 years of spaceflight experience. The species that took it had a single homeworld. The species that took it had been classified, in official Council records that I myself had helped prepare, as a minimal threat pre-industrial civilization requiring standard compliance procedures. And the species that took it was calling the whole thing a warning. I looked down at my desk and saw that my hands were shaking, not from fear, from something else. Something I did not have a word for in my language, but that I would later learn humans called awe, The specific, overwhelming recognition that you are witnessing something that changes the shape of everything that comes after it. I closed my terminal, left the chamber, and walked to my quarters through corridors that felt different than they had that morning. The station was the same, the walls were the same, the recycled air tasted the same, but the certainty that had always filled these spaces, the absolute, granite-deep conviction that the Council was permanent, and its power was total, and the galaxy would always work the way it had always worked, that was gone. Marin Cole had pulled it out of the walls with a single word, and her people had confirmed its absence with 2,000 ships and 9 hours of surgical, merciful, terrifying precision. I reached my quarters, sat on the edge of my bed, and opened my personal log. I wrote one line. The fleet is gone. I do not think it is coming back. I do not think anything is coming back. Then I sat in the dark and waited for whatever came next, and I found that for the first time in my adult life, I had absolutely no idea what that might be. The morning after Torek Vaughn delivered his report, I arrived at my station to find the Council already in emergency session. I had not been summoned. I simply came because I did not know what else to do. The routine of sitting at my desk and processing documents was the only solid ground I had left, and even that felt like standing on ice that was beginning to crack. The debate had been raging since before dawn. I could hear it through the chamber doors, voices overlapping with a raw urgency that would have been unthinkable a week earlier. The Council did not raise voices. The Council did not argue. The Council issued decrees, and the galaxy obeyed. But the rules that governed Council behavior were built on the assumption that the Council always won, and that assumption had been dismantled 9 hours at a time in a system at the edge of an unremarkable spiral arm. I heard Councillor Dreth calling for full mobilization. The enforcement fleet had been 200 ships. The Council's total military capacity was approximately 1,500 frontline warships, with another 3,000 support and logistics vessels. Dreth wanted to send everything. Every combat-capable ship, every reserve unit, every garrison force, pulled from every tributary system. A hammer so large that no amount of human preparation could withstand it. Other councillors pushed back. Councillor Naval, who oversaw economic affairs, pointed out that pulling garrison forces from tributary systems would leave those systems unpoliced. The tribute collection infrastructure depended on the visible presence of Council military power. Remove that presence, even temporarily, and the subject species might begin to reconsider their compliance. The Council's authority was built on the perception of invincibility. That perception had already taken damage. Stripping the garrisons would make the damage visible. Councillor Pren, the intelligence overseer, raised a different concern. If humanity had hidden 4,000 weapons platforms and 2,000 warships from 90 years of Council surveillance, what else had they hidden? The intelligence failure was total. Every assumption in the military assessment was wrong. Sending the full armada into a system where they could not accurately predict what was waiting for them was not strategy. It was hope dressed in uniform. And beneath all of these arguments, unspoken, but present in every raised voice and clenched hand, was the real fear. The fear that I had been carrying since I calculated what 8.5 billion people could build in 90 years. The fear that the enforcement fleet had not lost because it was too small. The fear that it had lost because humanity was something the Council had never encountered before, something their 12,000 years of dominion had not prepared them for. A species that could not be intimidated, a species that prepared for threats before those threats even knew they existed. A species that fought not with formations and doctrines and synchronized tactics, but with individual creativity, adaptability, and an almost unreasonable refusal to accept any outcome they had not chosen for themselves. The debate was still raging when the long-range sensors triggered a priority alert that cut through the noise like a blade through paper. Every screen in the command center, every display in the Council chamber, every terminal on every deck of Aegis Primus lit up with the same contact report. A fleet had entered Council space. Not a Council fleet, not a tributary fleet, a human fleet. I pulled the sensor data to my screen and felt the ground shift beneath me. The contact count was climbing, 300 ships, 500, 800. The number kept rising as the human formation, if you could call it a formation, resolved on the long-range displays. They had brought their own ships, fast and angular, and built with a design philosophy that prioritized function over elegance. And they had brought the 200 captured Council warships, refitted, repainted, and carrying energy signatures that did not match any Council weapon system on record. They had taken the Council's own ships and upgraded them. The final count stabilized at just over 1,000 vessels. Not enough to match the Council's full armada in a straight fight, but they had not come for a straight fight. They had come, as far as any of us could tell, to stand there. The human fleet took up position at the edge of Council space, within sensor range of Aegis Primus, and stopped. They did not advance, they did not fire. They did not issue threats or demands or ultimatums. They simply arrived, like a neighbor who walks up to your fence and stands there, hands in pockets, looking at your house, with an expression that says, "I am here, and I am not leaving, and we both know there is nothing you can do about it." The Council had spent 12,000 years going to other species. Nobody had ever come to the Council. Doyen Rethak stared at the sensor display for a very long time. Then he asked a question that no one in the chamber could answer. What are they doing? The answer came 40 minutes later, but it did not come to the Council. It came to everyone. Marin Cole's voice appeared on every communications channel in Council space simultaneously. Not just Council military frequencies, not just diplomatic channels. Every tributary world, every vassal species, every conscripted population, every freighter and mining platform, and orbital habitat received the same broadband transmission at the same moment. It was a feat of communications technology that the Council's own systems could not have replicated, and it meant that the humans had been inside the Council's communications infrastructure long enough to map every node, every relay, every frequency. The message was simple. Marin Cole spoke in clear, unaccented galactic standard, and she spoke directly to the species who had been paying tribute. This is Captain Marin Cole of the United Earth Command, broadcasting to all species within the jurisdiction of the Galactic Tribute Council. You have been told that tribute is mandatory. You have been told that refusal is impossible. You have been told that the Council's power is absolute and eternal, and that resistance means destruction. 13 days ago, Earth refused to pay tribute. 11 days ago, the Council sent 200 warships to force our compliance. 9 hours after they arrived, we captured every ship. Every crew member is alive and unharmed. We are now positioned at the edge of Council space, with those ships and our own. We are still here. We have not been destroyed. We have not been diminished. We said no, and we are still here. You can say no too. The transmission ended, and in the hours that followed, I watched the machinery of galactic civilization begin to stutter. The first species to stop tribute shipments was the Prelians. Their convoy of mineral transports, already en route to a Council processing station, reversed course within 2 hours of the broadcast. The Prelians had been paying tribute for 3,000 years. They had never missed a shipment. They had never even filed a formal complaint. And now, because a species they had never met had shown them that the word no was survivable, they turned their ships around. By the end of the first day, 11 more species had suspended shipments. By the second day, the number was 31. Trade routes that had operated without interruption for millennia went dark. Processing stations designed to handle the resource output of 100 worlds sat empty. The economic infrastructure that powered the Council's military, that funded its administration, that paid for the very station I was sitting on, began to starve. Doyen Rethak ordered the Armada to engage the human fleet. 1,500 warships, against roughly 1,000. On paper, the advantage was clear. 1,500 ships built to Council specifications, crewed by professional military personnel, operating under tactical doctrines refined over 12,000 years of dominance. Against a mixed fleet of human-built vessels and captured Council ships modified with alien technology. The numbers favored the Council. The experience favored the Council. The firepower favored the Council. I watched the engagement from the command center on Aegis Primus, surrounded by officers and aides and analysts who tracked every contact on every display with the desperate focus of people watching their world either hold together or fall apart. The Armada advanced in standard formation. Line abreast, capital ships in the center, screening elements on the flanks, reserve force trailing at medium distance. It was the same formation the Council had used for thousands of years because it had never failed. It was elegant, disciplined, and perfectly synchronized. Every ship moving in concert, like notes in a song that had been composed so long ago that no one remembered the original key. The human fleet did not advance. They waited. And when the Armada crossed into engagement range, the humans did something that every tactical officer in the command center described, independently and using almost identical words, as impossible. They scattered. Not in retreat, not in panic. They dispersed their fleet into dozens of independent groups, each one moving on a different vector, at a different speed, executing a different tactical objective. There was no central formation, no unified command structure that the Council's tactical computers could identify and predict. Each human group fought as its own entity, making decisions in real time based on local conditions, adapting to the Armada's movements, not as a fleet responding to orders, but as 1,000 individual minds, each solving a different problem simultaneously. The Council's tactical doctrine was built for fighting fleets. Organized, hierarchical, predictable fleets. The doctrine had answers for every formation, every maneuver, every standard tactical scenario that 12,000 years of warfare had produced. But it did not have an answer for this. It did not have an answer for an opponent that was not a fleet at all, but a swarm of individual decision-makers, each one creative, each one unpredictable, each one capable of inventing a new tactic in the middle of an engagement and executing it without waiting for approval from above. I watched a group of 6 human ships, tiny compared to the Council's capital vessels, execute a maneuver that no tactical computer in the command center could categorize. They accelerated directly toward a Council battleship formation, drawing concentrated fire from multiple angles, then split apart at the last possible moment and looped behind the formation, striking at the exposed engine sections while the battleships were still turning their weapons around. By the time the formation adjusted, the human ships were gone, already engaging a different target 3 sectors away. This happened simultaneously across the entire engagement zone, dozens of independent actions, each one different, each one exploiting a different weakness in the Armada's synchronized response. The Council fleet was a machine, a beautiful, powerful, ancient machine, and the humans were sand in its gears. The engagement lasted 11 hours. The Armada retreated with 40% losses, not because the humans had superior firepower, but because the Council fleet could not adapt fast enough to an enemy that refused to fight by any recognizable rules. Every time the Armada adjusted to a human tactic, the humans were already doing something else. Every time a Council commander identified a pattern, the pattern dissolved and a new one emerged. It was not chaos, it was creativity, applied at a speed and scale that the Council's institutional memory had no framework to comprehend. The retreat order came from Admiral Soren, and when it was transmitted across the command center speakers, the room fell silent. Not the shocked silence of the first hearing, or the bewildered silence of Vaughn's debrief. This was the silence of finality, the silence of people who understood, in the marrow of their bones, that the thing they had always believed was permanent had just proven to be fragile. I watched Doyen Rethak receive the retreat confirmation. The old counselor sat in his seat and did not speak for a very long time. Around him, the other counselors waited, and their waiting had a quality of deference that I had not seen before. The recognition that the next words spoken in this room would define whatever came next, and that nobody wanted to be the one to speak them. Finally, Rethak turned to me. He looked at me, Valen Shou, junior diplomatic aide, the person who prepared compliance forms and organized files and made sure the ink was dry. He looked at me and asked a question that, in 12,000 years of demanding tribute from the galaxy, the Council had never once needed to ask. What do they want? I opened my mouth. I closed it. I opened it again. Nobody had ever asked me for my opinion on anything beyond document formatting, and the question was so vast that for a moment, I could not find a handhold anywhere in its surface. Then I remembered something. I turned to my terminal and pulled up Marin Cole's personnel file, the one I had read on the first day, when she walked into the chamber alone and said no. I scrolled past her military service record, past her command qualifications, past her diplomatic authorization codes. I found the entry I was looking for. Pre-service career, educator, primary and secondary levels, 14 years. I looked at Rethak. She was a school teacher, I said. Before all of this, she taught children. Rethak stared at me. He did not understand what I was trying to tell him, and honestly, I was not entirely sure I understood it myself. But the fact sat in my chest with the weight of something fundamental. A school teacher had walked into the most powerful room in the galaxy, told an empire no, and the empire had blinked. Not a general, not a president, not a warrior bred for conquest or a politician sculpted for confrontation. A woman who had spent 14 years helping children learn how to read and think and ask questions. That was what they sent. That was who they chose to deliver the word that broke the system. And that choice told me more about humanity than any dossier or military assessment or sensor contact report ever could. I looked at Rethak, and I told him the truth, the simplest, most honest answer I had. I think they want what they have always wanted. They want to be left alone, and they want everyone else to have the same choice. Rethak said nothing, but in his silence, I heard something I had never heard from him before. Not agreement exactly, not acceptance, but the absence of certainty. The space where certainty used to be, now empty, now waiting to be filled with something new. And across that space, 1,000 human ships hung at the edge of Council territory, patient and still, and utterly unafraid, and the galaxy held its breath and waited to find out what came next. 3 weeks after the Armada's retreat, Doyen Rethak summoned me to his personal chambers. In 11 years of service, I had never been inside those rooms. Junior aides communicated with the Doyen through 3 layers of intermediaries, and being called directly was so far outside normal procedure that my first thought was that I was being dismissed. His chambers were smaller than I expected. A single room with a curved window that looked out over the docking ring of Aegis Primus. The furniture was old, heavy, the kind of furniture that accumulated weight not from its materials, but from the years it had spent being sat upon by people who made decisions that shaped the lives of billions. Rethak was standing at the window when I entered, watching the lights of departing ships, and it took me a moment to realize what I was seeing. The ships were tribute transports, but they were not arriving. They were leaving, empty. How many? I asked before I could stop myself. It was not my place to ask questions. 47 species have suspended tribute as of this morning, Rethak said, without turning from the window. 3 more are expected by evening. 12 have issued formal declarations of withdrawal from the Council framework entirely. The Korath Federation has established direct diplomatic contact with Earth. So have the Delvians, and the Prelians. He turned from the window and looked at me with eyes that carried 600 years of absolute power, and beneath that, something I had never expected to see. Exhaustion. Not physical exhaustion. The exhaustion of a mind that had been built around a single truth for 6 centuries and was now watching that truth dissolve. You have been reading their literature, he said. It was not a question. Somehow, he knew. Perhaps the intelligence division had flagged my personal archive access. Perhaps he had simply guessed, tell me what you have found. I had been reading human literature for weeks, not their military history, not their technical specifications, their philosophy, their poetry, their arguments about how societies should be organized and how power should be distributed, and what obligations the strong owed to the weak. I had read thinkers from across their history, minds that grappled with questions the Council had answered 12,000 years ago and never revisited. They have a concept, I said, one that does not translate directly into any Council language. The closest approximation is a word that means the inherent value of a thinking being, not value based on utility or productivity or contribution to a system, value that exists simply because the being exists. They call it dignity. A philosophical abstraction. No, I said, and I was surprised by the firmness in my own voice. It is not abstract to them. It is the foundation of everything they build. Their laws, their institutions, their relationships with each other. The idea that every person carries a worth that cannot be given or taken away by any authority. It cannot be taxed. It cannot be tithed. It cannot be confiscated. It simply is. And this is why they said no. This is why they could never have said anything else. Rethok lowered himself into a chair that was older than most civilizations and pressed his fingertips together in front of his face. A concept, he said slowly, that makes tribute inherently impossible. Not tactically or economically, philosophically. Yes. Then it was never about the ships, or the weapons platforms, or the fleet. No, those were consequences. The word was the weapon. He understood. I could see it moving through him like a wave passing through water, reshaping everything it touched without breaking the surface. The Council had been fighting a military battle. Humanity had been fighting an ideological one. The fleet, the captured ships, the broadcast, the battle, all of it was secondary to the real attack, which was an idea. The idea that refusal was possible. The idea that tribute was not gravity, not an immutable force of nature, but a choice imposed by one group of beings on another, and choices, unlike gravity, could be refused. The collapse was accelerating. Every day brought new defections. Species that had paid tribute for thousands of years were recalculating the math that had kept them compliant, and the math no longer worked. The Council's military, diminished by the losses in Sol and the engagement at the border, could not enforce compliance across 1,000 tributary systems simultaneously. The garrisons that remained were outnumbered by the populations they were supposed to control. The economic pipeline that funded Council operations was drying up. The system was not being attacked. It was being abandoned. I watched it happen from my desk, processing documents that grew less relevant by the hour. Tribute schedules for species that were no longer paying, garrison deployment orders for stations that were being voluntarily evacuated, compliance reports with empty fields where numbers used to be. The paperwork of an empire discovering that it was made of paper. On the 31st day after the broadcast, Marin Cole requested a final audience. This time, she did not come alone. She entered the tribute chamber, flanked by ambassadors from 16 species. I recognized the Prelian delegate, the Korath representative, the Delvian consul, species that had been subject peoples 3 weeks earlier, standing shoulder to shoulder with the woman who had taught them that the word no was not a death sentence. The chamber felt different, not physically. The same black stone, the same elevated seats, the same cold light. But the weight of the room had shifted. The counselors in their high seats no longer looked like they were floating above the proceedings. They looked like they were perched on a ledge that was crumbling beneath them. Marin Cole took her position at the center of the speaking circle. The 16 ambassadors arranged themselves behind her, not in a formation, but in a loose, natural grouping that somehow conveyed more solidarity than any choreographed display of unity could have. "I am here," she said, "to offer a proposal." Rethok gestured for her to continue. The gesture was different from the last time, less a command, more an invitation. "The tribute system is over," Marin said. "Not because we ended it, but because the species who supported it have chosen to stop. That choice belongs to them, not to us. What I am here to propose is what comes next." She outlined the terms of a compact, not a tribute arrangement, not a treaty imposed by the strong on the weak. A voluntary trade agreement, open commerce between all participating species, with standardized protocols and mutual tariff structures. A shared defense framework, not controlled by any single species or council, but coordinated through a joint command with rotating leadership. Technology exchange programs, with protections for developing species to prevent exploitation. Open borders for civilian transit, with security provisions agreed upon by all members. The terms were generous. More than generous. They were the kind of terms that a species offers when it has won completely, and chooses not to act like it. Councillor Naval, the economic overseer, leaned forward. "You hold the advantage. Your fleet sits at our border. Half our tributary base has abandoned us. You could demand anything. Why offer terms that treat us as equals?" Marin Cole looked at him for a moment, and her expression carried something that I had come to recognize as distinctly human. A patience that was not passivity, an understanding that the person across from you might need a moment to catch up. "Because the point was never to beat you," she said. The point was to make sure nobody has to kneel. The chamber absorbed those words the way stone absorbs water, slowly, deeply, without any outward sign of change. Counselor Pren, the intelligence overseer, spoke next. You have been preparing for this moment for 90 years. You studied our methods. You mapped our weaknesses. You built weapons specifically designed to defeat our ships. Forgive my skepticism, but this degree of preparation suggests an agenda that extends beyond mere self-defense. Marin nodded. You are right. It does extend beyond self-defense. We prepared because we saw what you did to other species, and we decided that it needed to stop. Not just for us. For everyone. We could have hidden. We could have built our defenses and told the galaxy to solve its own problems. We chose not to. Because we believe that a galaxy where any species can be forced to kneel is a galaxy that is broken, regardless of whether we personally are the ones kneeling. You appointed yourselves as liberators, Pren said. No, we appointed ourselves as the species willing to go first. There is a difference. The debate continued for hours. Every clause of the compact was examined, challenged, revised. The counselors pushed back on points of sovereignty, on military command structures, on economic frameworks. Marin and her coalition responded to every objection with specific proposals, alternative formulations, compromise language. It was the most substantive diplomatic negotiation in council history, because it was the first one where both sides had actual power. I processed documents through all of it. But these were different documents. Not compliance forms, not tribute schedules. These were drafts of an agreement between equals, and every word I typed felt like laying a brick in a building that had never been built before. Near the end, as the final language was being settled, Doyen Rethak asked to speak. The chamber quieted. He had been silent for most of the session, listening with an intensity that seemed to cost him physical effort. I have one question, he said, and his voice was quieter than I had ever heard it. When you stood in this chamber 34 days ago and said no, were you afraid? Marin Cole met his eyes. She did not hesitate, but she did not rush either. She let the question sit between them for a moment, respecting its weight. Terrified, she said. We all were. Every person on Earth who knew what was coming. Every engineer who built those weapons platforms. Every pilot who trained for the engagement. Every strategist who planned for the possibility that we might lose everything. We were all terrified. Then why? Rethak asked. Why say it? Because being afraid does not mean you have to say yes. It just means saying no costs you something, and some things are worth the cost. Rethak held her gaze for a long time. Then he nodded, slowly, once, and said something that I have replayed in my memory 1,000 times since that day. Something that I believe he meant more deeply than anything he had said in 600 years of leadership. That is why you won. He signed the compact. The other counselors followed. The 16 ambassadors added their marks. And just like that, with ink on paper and witnesses present, 12,000 years of enforced tribute ended. Not with a war, not with a conquest, not with a new empire replacing the old one. With an agreement, a choice, a word that meant something only because the people who signed it were free to walk away and chose to stay. I left the council's service 3 weeks later. Not in anger, not in shame. I left because the institution I had served no longer existed in a form that required my particular skills, and because a different opportunity had presented itself. The new compact established liaison offices on every member world, and Earth was accepting applications from non-human diplomats for cultural exchange postings. I applied. I was accepted. I think they accepted me because I was the aide whose compliance form never got completed. Someone in their command apparently thought that was funny. I arrived on Earth on a morning in their northern autumn, when the air was cool and the light came through the clouds at a low angle that turned everything gold. The city they assigned me to was called Oxford, a small place by their standards, ancient by any standard, full of stone buildings and narrow streets, and more books per square meter than I had seen on the entire station of Aegis Primus. I spent my first few weeks learning the rhythms of human daily life, which were disorienting in their disorder. They did not operate on centralized schedules. They did not coordinate their movements through any visible command structure. They simply went about their lives, making individual decisions about where to go, and what to do, and how to spend their time. And somehow the result was not chaos, but a functioning civilization of extraordinary complexity. It was as if someone had poured 8 billion random elements into a container and shaken it, and instead of producing noise, it had produced a symphony. On my 23rd day on Earth, I was walking through the city center when I passed a building with large windows at street level. Through the glass, I could see a room full of children. Small humans, perhaps 6 or 7 years old by their counting, seated at low tables with books and papers and bright-colored tools for drawing. A woman stood at the front of the room, and she was asking them a question. I could not hear the words through the glass, but I could see the response. Every child raised a hand. Not in unison, not on command, not because a protocol demanded it. Each child raised a hand individually, eagerly, some of them stretching so high they lifted off their seats, some of them waving to catch the teacher's attention, all of them desperate to be called upon, desperate to answer, desperate to participate. Not one child sat still, not one child waited for permission. I stood on that sidewalk and watched, and something shifted inside me that I cannot fully describe even now. I thought about the tribute chamber, where the entire architecture was designed to make the summoned species feel small. I thought about how the Council's power rested on the principle that the natural state of beings was obedience, that authority flowed downward from the powerful to the powerless, and that the correct response to a demand from above was compliance. And I watched those children, those tiny, fragile, impossibly confident children, raising their hands without fear, offering answers without certainty, participating in the act of learning with a joy that was so natural and so unrehearsed that it could only come from a species that taught its young, from the very beginning, that their voices mattered, that their thoughts had value, that the appropriate response to a question was not silence, but engagement. This was where it came from. Not the weapons platforms, not the warships, not the tactical genius or the industrial capacity or the 90 years of preparation. It came from this. From classrooms full of children who were taught, before they could even properly hold a pencil, that they had the right to raise their hands. That they had the right to be heard. That no authority, no matter how vast, had the right to tell them that their answer did not matter. I thought about Marin Cole, schoolteacher turned diplomat, turned the woman who broke an empire with a single syllable, and I understood at last why humanity chose her. They chose her because she was not a weapon or a warrior or a symbol of military might. She was a teacher, and what she taught the galaxy, standing alone in that vast, dark chamber, with nothing but her voice and her refusal, was the same thing she had taught children for 14 years in a classroom in Bristol. You have the right to raise your hand. You have the right to speak. And when someone bigger than you demands your silence, you have the right, the absolute and unassailable right, to look them in the eye and say no. They asked me later, when I wrote my memoir, what the most powerful word in the galaxy was. Everyone expected me to say no. They expected it because that was the word that started everything, the word that cracked the foundation of 12,000 years of dominion, the word that Marin Cole spoke twice in the tribute chamber, and that echoed outward until it reached every corner of known space. But they were wrong. The most powerful word was not the one that started the revolution. It was the one that came after. The one that humanity had been teaching its children since before it knew there were stars. The word that turned obedient subjects into free citizens and terrified tributaries into willing partners, and a junior diplomatic aide from a dead empire into a person standing on a sidewalk in Oxford, watching children learn, and finally understanding what it meant to be alive in a galaxy where the old order had fallen and something better was being built in its place. The word was why. Because once you ask it, once you teach a child to ask it, once you build a civilization on the principle that every being has the right to ask it, you can never kneel again. You can never pay tribute to a power that cannot answer the question. You can never accept a system that demands your compliance without justification. The word why is the end of every empire that rules by force, and the beginning of every society that governs by consent. Marin Cole knew this. She knew it because she was a teacher, and teachers know that the most dangerous thing you can give a mind is not a weapon, but a question. The Council had weapons. The council had ships and soldiers and 12,000 years of institutional momentum. But they did not have an answer to why. And when a single human woman stood in their chamber and refused to kneel, she was not just saying no, she was asking why. Why should we pay? Why should we kneel? Why should any species surrender its freedom to another? The council had no answer. They had never needed one, and in the absence of an answer, the word no became not just possible, but inevitable. I live on Earth now. I have lived here for 2 years. I work at the Compact Liaison Office in Oxford, processing trade agreements and cultural exchange documents, and all the small, tedious, essential paperwork of a galaxy learning to function without an empire at its center. It is quiet work. It lacks the grandeur of the tribute chamber and the weight of the compliance forms I used to fill. But every document I process represents a choice, a voluntary agreement between free species, a transaction built on consent rather than coercion. And that difference, that small, enormous, world-shaping difference, is the thing that gets me out of bed every morning. Sometimes, on my way to work, I pass that school, the same building with the large windows, the same classroom, different children now, a new year, new faces, new hands reaching for the ceiling. And every time I pass it, I stop, just for a moment, just long enough to watch a child raise a hand and a teacher nod and a voice speak up with an answer that might be right or might be wrong, but is offered freely, without fear, into a room that was built to listen. And I think to myself that this is it. This is the thing the Council never understood. This is the thing that 200 warships could not suppress, and 1,500 more could not defeat. Not the ships, not the weapons, not the industrial capacity or the tactical brilliance, or the stubborn, beautiful, infuriating human refusal to be told what they could not do. It was this, a room full of raised hands. A species that taught its children to speak before it taught them to obey. A civilization built not on the principle that the powerful had the right to command, but on the belief, the deep, unshakable, ferocious belief, that every voice deserved to be heard. That is what broke the Council. That is what ended 12,000 years of tribute. That is what changed the galaxy. Not a fleet, not a weapon, not a war. A word, and then a question, and then a galaxy full of raised hands, reaching upward, finally free.